Wind Waker is the first Zelda game on the GameCube, and the third 3D Zelda game overall. Majora's and Ocarina had a lot of similarities due to being built on the same engine. Wind Waker feels like a fundamentally different game. It still follows the core formula and is unmistakably Zelda, but the focus on sailing makes for a shift in gameplay. It's time to jump into the Evolution of Zelda, the Wind Waker. Wind Waker was released in 2002, 2 years after Majora's Mask. I struggled to find many concrete details about the development. Many sources state that the game was rushed out for a holiday release. At least 2 planned dungeons were cut. There's a few claims that the Triforce Hunt was added to the game to make up for the cut content. The game doesn't lack polish, but there are some points which feel like padding. Wind Waker's announcement was met with controversy, and now infamous tech demo shown at Space World 2000 showed a fight between Ganondorf and Link with a realistic art style. When Nintendo later revealed that the GameCube's first Zelda game would use a cel-shaded art style, fans were in uproar. Many outlets and fans derided the game's art style as childish and cartoony. Ironically, it's the cel-shaded art style that has made Wind Waker's visuals age so well. The heavily stylized look has a timeless aspect which is aided by fantastic art direction. Every animation is filled with character. Link is so expressive this time around that he almost doesn't feel like a silent protagonist. Little flourishes, like Link trying to keep his footing when he jumps onto the boat, give the animations a level of polish far beyond the previous games. The character and enemy designs are the standout. The designs are colourful and the cel shading makes them pop from the background. Just about every classic Zelda enemy in this game looks better than they ever have. Monster designs are striking and show a clear resemblance to the original designs, despite having their own twists. My only criticism is with the environments. Although there are plenty of areas which stand out, there's also a lot of generic grassy islands. Some of the dungeon and story set pieces are memorable, but most of the optional environments blend into one another. Wind Waker features many improvements over the previous games. 3D games were more mature by this point and it shows. The camera controls much better and the gameplay overall feels smoother. There's still a bit of jankiness and the controls still aren't up to modern standards, but it's a major improvement. Navigating around the menus feels faster. Considering how often you open the menu to switch items, this dramatically improves the gameplay flow. There's a ton of these small improvements. Both the previous games were built on Ocarina's engine. The time gap between Wind Waker and Ocarina was 4 years. That might not be much time by today's standards, but 3D games evolved so much during that period. Perhaps the biggest gameplay change is that the overworld is now an ocean. The Great Sea is divided into a 7x7 grid, with each space having its own island or other point of interest. The size of these islands vary. Some are huge towns or dungeons, others are small mini-games or side puzzles that take just a few minutes. The map is huge and sailing around takes a while. You do eventually get access to fast travel to a limited number of islands, but you'll still spend a long time sailing around. This is what I mean when I say there's been a shift in gameplay. Most of the gameplay is spent sailing, a mechanic that didn't exist in the previous games. The sailing is usually as simple as pointing the boat in the right direction and waiting. You may run into enemies or other distractions, but for the most part the areas between islands are empty. You do find charts which lead you to treasure, but this treasure is always within a short distance of an island, never out in the open sea. All this downtime gives the game a more leisurely pace. Once you get to an island, you can find and feed a fish, which will fill out that square of the map. Filling out the map is satisfying in a completionist way, and will make the Triforce Hunt way easier. The world is more open than Ocarina and Majora's. You can go to almost any island at any time. The downside to this is that you'll often start exploring an island only to realise you can't complete the puzzle yet. Despite the whole world being open from the start, it feels better to leave the exploration for when you have more tools. Most of the optional content comes from exploring islands in the ocean. The islands usually contain a small puzzle or minigame. These are similar to what you'd expect from other Zelda games. None of these puzzles are complicated, they're small distractions rather than major challenges. The reward for side content is usually a piece of heart, rupees, or a chart. Let's start by talking about the new edition, charts. A chart will show an island and an area marked with an X. You can then find that island on your map, sail there, and dig up a treasure. This treasure hunting is a cool idea, but the execution isn't great. When you get a chart, you're being given another task to complete instead of an actual reward. The charts lead you to rupees or pieces of heart, but if the reward wasn't a chart, it would be one of those anyway. To make things worse, the treasure isn't necessarily going to be near where you picked up the chart. This means that when you get a chart, you don't usually get the reward until far later. As for the other rewards, I found them to be one of the weaker parts of the game. This game throws so many rupees at you that you'll often have thousands. While there is a mandatory rupee sink, I had more than enough rupees by the time I got to it. I always felt like I had more rupees than I could spend, so getting more never felt impactful. As always, a piece of heart is a nice reward. More health is never a bad thing. That said, it's only a valuable reward if the game is difficult. I never felt at risk of dying, so the pieces of heart became meaningless. This may sound negative, but I still liked the side content. It's just that I was completing it more for intrinsic enjoyment rather than the extrinsic rewards. Now let's talk about combat. I found the combat in this game easier than Majora and Ocarina. That may just be because I've gotten better at it, but it's hard to say. The controls are snappier and more responsive, giving you more control over Link than before. Combat has also seen some new mechanics, such as being able to dodge in time with an attack to perform a counter. The window is generous and has a sound cue. You won't miss it if you're going for it. Link has access to some other new tools, such as being able to pick up enemy weapons. I never really found a use for these. Link's moveset with his sword is far smoother than with any of the enemy weapons. At its core, the combat in this game is similar to the previous games. If you're familiar with combat in 3D Zelda, you won't find many surprises here. Every enemy type requires a different strategy to defeat, so you have to pay attention to the specific enemies you're fighting. Most of the enemies show up early on, and it feels like you're fighting the same ones for most of the game. Windwaker could do with more enemy variety, especially in the later parts of the game. There's a lot more combat encounters in this game, and they often include many enemies. While I did enjoy the combat, I found it got a bit repetitive by the end, especially with later areas like the Savage Labyrinth being non-stop combat gauntlets. Enemies take a bit too long to kill, and there's a few too many of them. There are long combat sections without any real challenge, which began to feel tedious to me. Dungeons in Wind Waker remain one of the highlights of the game. They're also one of the areas that has changed the least. They're all well designed, but none of them stand out. There's no huge labyrinths like the Water Temple, and no crazy concepts like the Stone Tower. The most notable dungeons are the Earth and Wind Temples. These temples feature a partner who follows you around and you can control. The puzzles around these feel distinct from the previous two games. Neither temple feels like it explores the partner mechanics to their fullest, and I find myself wishing they'd done more with them. Many of the dungeons in this game are small, and even the biggest ones aren't massive. They also don't increase in complexity that much throughout the game. The absence of the two cut dungeons is badly felt. The dungeons in Wind Waker are good, but if dungeons are your main draw to the Zelda games, you may be disappointed. Wind Waker's dungeons are a smaller part of the experience compared to the previous games. The bosses are where the art direction really shines. They all look amazing and are fantastic set pieces. Each boss has a striking visual design. They look unlike anything in the rest of the game without feeling out of place. The fights are standard Zelda fare, puzzle-based bosses which fall easily to the right strategy. I enjoyed all the bosses except for Mulgera, where I felt the lock-on system got in the way. Wind Waker takes place long after the events of Ocarina. The hero disappeared back to their own time. Hyrule has flooded, but I'll avoid spoiling why. The game is a sequel to Ocarina and makes a few references to the events of that game, but it's distinct enough to work as a standalone experience. The world building here is solid. The largest of the islands have been built into villages and towns, but the overall population is sparse as you'd expect. The seas are dangerous, and so most people take refuge on the islands. Like archipelago nations in the real world, the majority of the population live on a minority of the islands. Windfall Island has by far the biggest population, and for the most part is self-sustaining. Through this level of attention, Wind Waker creates a world that's both believable and fantastical. The story itself may seem simple at first, but there's more going on than meets the eye. At first, it seems like a simple hero's journey, but they managed to fit some interesting themes within this structure. I don't want to get too heavy into spoilers, but there's a consistent theme of change. Almost every character is faced with the inevitability of change at some point. All things must come to an end eventually. Dwelling on the past will get you nowhere. This theme is represented even in the world itself. Hyrule has flooded, the old world is gone, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. This theme starts off light, but gets more emphasised throughout the game. The game is not story heavy by any means, but what is here is well written. There's enough depth to be interesting, and it's delivered with only a small amount of exposition. It's not as dense as Majora's story, but it doesn't need to be. It strikes a good balance between being interesting without being overbearing. The music of Wind Waker is higher fidelity than the N64 games. The music is very different to the previous games, although there are motifs that call back to the older music. As you'd expect from Koji Kondo, the music is fantastic. It mostly strikes an upbeat tone, but has some darker tracks for dungeons and story moments. The soundtrack features more instruments and a more epic feel compared to the previous games. Music has been a highlight of Zelda since the start. Wind Waker once again shows the composer's ability to create entirely new music that captures the feel of the series. The music in this game is varied, and does a great job of providing tone and atmosphere. I usually avoid mentioning remasters or remakes in these videos, but the HD remaster of Wind Waker deserves a special mention. The remaster makes a ton of quality of life improvements that I really missed going back to the original for this video. Firstly, it adds the Swift Sail, which lets you sail faster and automatically changes the wind direction to match wherever you're going. It includes other changes such as shortening the Triforce Shard hunt and not getting knocked off your boat whenever you take damage. All of this adds up to dramatically shorten the amount of time you spend sailing. The original art style remains intact and no notable content is removed. The HD remaster is the definitive version of the game and there's not much reason to play the original instead. Wind Waker is an interesting game. In some ways, it's so different from the other 3D Zelda games that it's hard to compare. Most of the game is spent exploring the Great Sea. The traditional Zelda features are still present, but haven't really developed or changed in big ways. The dungeons and combat haven't significantly evolved from Ocarina. Regardless, Wind Waker is a great game. It isn't without flaws, but most of them are minor nitpicks rather than major issues. The HD remaster fixes most of my gripes, and even in the original, there aren't enough issues to spoil the game. Wind Waker represents Zelda experimenting with something a little different, something we've seen often from this series. The resulting game is one that's built a dedicated fanbase, and for good reason. That's all for this episode of the Evolution of Zelda. Join me next time when I cover the Minish Cap on Game Boy Advance. I've decided to skip Four Swords Adventure for this series, along with the other multiplayer focused games. I plan to cover some Zelda spin-offs at some point, so I'll revisit the multiplayer games then. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode of the Evolution of Zelda.